The first time Ava Sinclair met Ethan Crawford, the night smelled of wet asphalt and roasted coffee beans. A drizzle misted over the city, turning street lamps into soft halos of gold. She had ducked into a small university cafe to escape the rain, clutching a portfolio of half-finished design sketches and business notes. He was already there, sitting alone at a corner table with a laptop that looked on the verge of collapse, a paper cup balanced precariously beside it. Ava noticed him before he noticed her. There was something restless about the way he tapped his fingers against the keyboard, a rhythm that matched the low hum of ambition she carried inside herself. He wore the determined look of someone who refused to accept the life he had been handed. When their eyes met for the first time, it was not romance that sparked but recognition, the quiet, electric understanding of two people who wanted more than ordinary survival. Ethan broke the silence with a smile that seemed both boyish and calculated. He invited her to share the only free seat in the cafe, sliding his scattered papers aside to make space. Ava hesitated for a heartbeat and then sat down, her damp coat brushing against his sleeve. They began talking, not about trivialities, but about ideas, the future of technology, the fragile dance between creativity and commerce, the kind of companies they wished existed but had never seen. Hours passed unnoticed as they traded concepts like seasoned partners who had been waiting for each other all along. From that night on, their lives fused into a single current. By day, Ava worked long shifts at a boutique marketing firm that barely paid her rent. Ethan juggled contract coding gigs for small businesses, writing software fixes that kept other people's dreams afloat. By night, they met in coffee shops and cramped apartments, feeding each other's hunger for something larger than the routines they endured. It was not a whirlwind romance of flowers and candlelight. It was a partnership built in the crucible of shared ambition, where affection grew out of late-night strategy sessions and whispered encouragements. Their early months together were a study in sacrifice. They pawned personal belongings to afford prototype software licenses. Ava sold her grandmother's antique bracelet, the last heirloom of a woman who had taught her the value of independence. Ethan gave up steady contracts to focus on their fledgling idea, a business that would use predictive analytics to help small retailers compete with corporate giants. They called it Crawford Innovations, though it was Ava who drew the first logo on a napkin and Ethan who argued for the clean symmetry of the name. Sleep became a luxury they could not afford. Ava learned to run marketing simulations on a second-hand laptop while Ethan coded through the night, the glow of the screen painting his face in shades of blue and silver. Their conversations were a blend of affection and problem-solving. They celebrated tiny victories, the first investor meeting that didn't end in dismissal, the first beta test that didn't crash after 2 minutes. Every failure was followed by Ethan's quiet reassurance, "We're still building, Ava, we're still moving forward." Money remained a constant threat. Their apartment smelled of instant noodles and cheap printer ink. There were weeks when they could not pay the electricity bill until the final notice arrived. But they treated each setback as a badge of honor, proof that they were risking everything for a future only they could see. On the rare nights they allowed themselves a walk along the river, Ava would lean into Ethan's shoulder and imagine the skyline with their names etched across it, not as a fantasy but as an inevitable destination. When they finally secured a modest angel investment, it felt less like luck and more like the natural reward for relentless persistence. Ava's marketing proposals dazzled the investors with precision and heart. Ethan's prototype demonstrated a level of technical elegance that belied their limited resources. The deal provided enough capital to rent a small office, little more than a converted storage unit with peeling paint and a flickering overhead light, but to them it was a palace. Their partnership deepened in ways neither had expected. Ethan proposed during a late-night coding session, slipping a simple silver ring across the keyboard with a crooked grin. There was no kneeling, no champagne, only the quiet hum of computers and the smell of takeout. Ava said yes with tears in her eyes, knowing that this was the kind of love she trusted more than grand gestures. Together they built a wedding around the constraints of their startup budget, an intimate rooftop ceremony with mismatched chairs and a skyline view that promised everything they were chasing. Marriage did not slow them. If anything, it fused their identities into a single force. Ava handled investor relations, branding, and long-term strategy with a sharpness that earned respect from seasoned financiers. Ethan refined the software, pushing updates that stunned early adopters. They learned to fight productively, arguing over algorithms and marketing copy, then reconciling with quiet apologies and the comfort of shared purpose. Every obstacle seemed like another challenge they would overcome side by side. But success has a way of altering the chemistry of a relationship long before anyone notices. With each new contract, Crawford Innovations grew in reputation and revenue. Invitations to industry events began to arrive, glittering galas and rooftop networking parties where champagne replaced instant noodles. Investors who had once dismissed them now sought their attention. Ethan thrived in the spotlight, his charisma sharpening with every interview. Eva celebrated each milestone, but she began to feel the subtle shift beneath the surface. The late-night conversations that had once been filled with shared dreams were now often interrupted by Ethan's buzzing phone, the glow of new opportunities pulling him toward a wider world. Still, in those early days, Eva clung to the belief that nothing could erode the partnership they had forged in struggle. She had built her life on the certainty that love, when combined with shared ambition, was unshakable. The empire they were creating seemed not just a company but a testament to everything they had promised each other on that rainy night when two dreamers found refuge in a small cafe and began to rewrite the future. The second stage of their journey began with a single signed contract and a flood of restless nights. The first client, a mid-sized retail chain on the brink of bankruptcy, trusted Crawford Innovations with a pilot program that promised to predict inventory needs with uncanny precision. For Eva and Ethan, it was more than a job, it was proof that their vision could breathe life into struggling businesses. They celebrated by sharing a single bottle of cheap wine in their one-bedroom apartment, the cork popping like a gunshot in the quiet night. The pilot project demanded everything they had. Ethan worked in a haze of code and caffeine, sometimes forgetting to eat. Eva juggled presentations, data analytics, and investor updates, often falling asleep at her desk with spreadsheets still glowing on the screen. They thrived on exhaustion, wearing it like a badge of honor. Every obstacle, a delayed data feed, a skeptical client, a bug that threatened to collapse the entire system, only deepened their resolve. When the client reported a 20% increase in efficiency within the first quarter, word spread quickly. Other retailers followed, and suddenly the little company that had once begged for attention was fielding calls from corporations far larger than they had dared to imagine. Investors returned with open checkbooks, eager to buy a piece of the technology Eva and Ethan had forged in obscurity. With growth came change. Their tiny storage room office gave way to a real headquarters, a sleek downtown space with glass walls and a view of the skyline they used to admire from the river. Eva remembered standing at the window on their first day there, the city stretching before her like a promise fulfilled. For a brief moment she allowed herself to believe that all their sacrifices had crystallized into a future of stability and shared triumph. But even in triumph, the shadows lengthened. Ethan began to crave more than success, he wanted recognition. He accepted every invitation to speak at conferences, every panel discussion, every photo opportunity. Reporters called him a visionary, a disruptor, a genius who had single-handedly transformed predictive analytics. At first, Eva laughed at the headlines, knowing the truth of their partnership. But over time, the laughter dimmed. Ethan stopped correcting interviewers who referred to Crawford Innovations as his creation. He brushed off Eva's gentle reminders with a distracted smile, claiming it was easier to let the media simplify the story. The small compromises began to stack like bricks. Ethan started staying late at networking events, returning home with the smell of expensive liquor and the faint trace of unfamiliar perfume. He explained it away with smooth excuses, last-minute investor meetings, after-hours coding sessions, strategy dinners she hadn't been invited to. Eva wanted to believe him. She reminded herself of the nights they had once shared in cramped cafes, when the thought of betrayal would have seemed absurd. Their conversations, once electric with ideas, grew functional and clipped. They talked about contracts, deadlines, and revenue forecasts but rarely about dreams. The man who once listened to her every thought now checked his phone mid-sentence, eyes flicking toward screens glowing with opportunity. When she asked if he was happy, He gave the kind of answer that sounded rehearsed. Of course, Ava. We're living everything we planned for. Despite the quiet unease, Ava kept working, believing that the company they had built would ultimately bring them back together. She told herself that periods of distance were natural in a growing business, that stress was a temporary storm. She doubled down on strategy, pitching new ideas and refining investor presentations until they were flawless. Her marketing campaigns drew national attention, pushing Crawford Innovations into the orbit of major corporations. Their personal life, however, became a series of polite negotiations. Date nights were rescheduled or cancelled altogether. Weekends turned into back-to-back business trips. Ethan grew more polished, his suits sharper, his hair always perfectly styled. He began using phrases like market dominance and strategic leverage, words that sounded more like weapons than dreams. The warmth in his voice cooled, replaced by the cadence of someone rehearsing for the next interview. It was during this phase of rapid expansion that Ava met Vanessa Holt for the first time. The introduction seemed harmless enough. Vanessa arrived at the office one morning as a consultant recommended by a high-profile investor. She was striking, sleek black hair, crimson lipstick, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Her resume sparkled with successful campaigns for luxury brands. Ethan introduced her as an asset to the company's upcoming rebranding effort, his voice carrying a note of admiration that made Ava's stomach tighten. Vanessa moved through the office with calculated precision, her heels clicking against the polished floors like a metronome of ambition. She lingered near Ethan's office more often than her duties required, offering insights and ideas with a familiarity that unsettled Ava. Whenever their eyes met, Vanessa offered a polite smile, warm enough to appear friendly, sharp enough to feel like a challenge. Ava told herself she was imagining things. After all, she and Ethan had weathered far greater storms than a beautiful consultant. But late at night, when she lay awake listening to the empty side of the bed, unease crept in like a draft beneath a locked door. Ethan's late nights became more frequent, his explanations vaguer. He began carrying a second phone, claiming it was for investor security. The transformation of Crawford Innovations mirrored the transformation of their marriage. The company was now a gleaming machine, efficient and unstoppable, while the relationship that had powered it began to fray like an overworked wire. Yet Ava, ever loyal to the dream they had once shared, refused to surrender. She tightened her grip on the company's direction, insisting on being present for every major decision. What she didn't know was that Ethan had already started making decisions without her. Deals were struck behind closed doors, patents reviewed by lawyers she had never met, and confidential meetings held under the guise of investor dinners. Vanessa's influence grew, her presence no longer confined to branding discussions. She became Ethan's shadow, always a step behind him in the office, a whisper in his ear during late-night calls. Still, Ava clung to hope. She remembered the rain-soaked night they had first met, the spark of recognition that had set their partnership ablaze. She believed, perhaps naively, that the man she had built an empire with could not simply forget the foundation of love and sacrifice beneath the glittering surface of success. What she failed to see was that Ethan was not forgetting, he was rewriting the story, carefully positioning himself as the sole architect of the dream they had once built together. The winter after Vanessa Holt joined Crawford Innovations was the company's most profitable season yet. Contracts poured in from international clients, and industry magazines ran glowing profiles of Ethan Crawford, calling him a visionary disruptor who had single-handedly reshaped predictive analytics. Ava read those articles with a carefully neutral expression, her name appearing only in footnotes, if at all. Each omission felt like a small erasure, a slow dissolving of the partnership she had once believed unbreakable. Ethan brushed off her concerns with a polished smile. "It's just media spin," he would say. "You know how reporters simplify things." But his voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone who had learned to enjoy the myth. At galas and conferences, Ava noticed how easily he slipped into the role of the solitary genius, shaking hands and accepting praise while she stood slightly behind him, the invisible co-architect of their empire. The imbalance seeped into their private life like a silent toxin. They still lived together in the penthouse apartment they had once dreamed of owning, but the space felt cavernous and cold. The walls, lined with awards and framed magazine covers, echoed with late-night phone calls and the muted click of Ethan's second phone. Their dinners, when they happened at all, were quick affairs of takeout and clipped conversations. Ethan's eyes were often elsewhere, scanning incoming messages with the intensity of a man juggling secrets. Ava responded the only way she knew how, by working harder. If Ethan wanted the spotlight, she would ensure the company itself remained unshakable. She spearheaded new marketing campaigns, secured partnerships with key investors, and tightened operational budgets until every department hummed with efficiency. Her efforts kept profits soaring and competitors at bay. Yet each achievement, instead of drawing Ethan closer, seemed to push him further away, as though her competence threatened the narrative he was crafting. The first undeniable crack appeared during a quarterly board meeting. It was late evening, the city glittering beyond the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows. Ava had prepared a detailed presentation on the company's expansion strategy, complete with growth projections and patent safeguards. As she began to speak, Ethan interrupted with a dazzling smile and a new proposal she had never seen, an aggressive international merger negotiated without her knowledge. The board erupted in excitement, their questions directed entirely at him. Ava sat in stunned silence as he outlined plans that undermined months of her careful strategy. When the meeting finally adjourned, she confronted him in the hallway. Ethan brushed her off with a casual shrug, claiming it had been a last-minute opportunity he hadn't had time to share. But his eyes held a flicker of challenge, as if daring her to object in front of the others. For the first time, Ava felt the sharp edge of exclusion inside the company she had helped create. Vanessa's presence during these transitions was unmistakable. She attended more meetings than her title required, always seated close to Ethan, her sleek hair catching the light like a polished blade. She offered subtle corrections during presentations, whispered suggestions that Ethan eagerly absorbed. Whenever Ava spoke, Vanessa's eyes lingered with a knowing glint, as if she were silently measuring the space Ava still occupied in Ethan's world. Rumors began to circulate among the staff, quiet speculations about late-night strategy sessions between Ethan and Vanessa, unrecorded dinners that stretched past midnight. Ava overheard fragments of conversation in the break room, the sudden hush when she entered. Loyalty within the company remained outwardly intact, but she sensed the slow shifting of allegiances. Employees who once sought her approval now looked to Ethan for direction, mirroring his growing confidence and subtle disregard for her authority. Despite the mounting tension, Ava refused to retreat. She reminded herself of the patents she had secured in the early days, intellectual property rights that bore her name as co-creator. She maintained private files of every agreement, every financial record, every proof that Crawford Innovations was as much hers as his. She trusted the paper trail more than the fading warmth of their marriage. At home, the silence grew heavier. Ethan returned later and later, sometimes not at all. When questioned, he offered vague explanations: investor dinners, unexpected travel, urgent negotiations. His phone, once left casually on the counter, now remained locked and out of reach. The scent of unfamiliar perfume lingered on his suits, faint but undeniable. Ava confronted him only once, asking directly if there was someone else. Ethan's laugh was smooth and practiced, a sound that offered no truth and no comfort. The emotional distance gnawed at her, but Ava forced herself to focus on what she could control. She spent long nights in the office, refining marketing models and strengthening client relationships. Work became her refuge, the one arena where her instincts remained sharp and her power undisputed. She told herself that success would eventually draw Ethan back, that the empire they had built together would remind him of their shared beginnings. Yet beneath the determination, a quiet fear took root. She remembered their first nights together in that tiny apartment, the way they had clung to each other against the world. Now they stood on opposite sides of the empire they had created, separated not by distance but by ambition and deceit. The man who had once promised forever was slowly transforming into a stranger, one who smiled for cameras while rewriting their story behind closed doors. The holiday season arrived with a glitter of false cheer. Crawford Innovations hosted its largest gala yet, a celebration of record profits and industry accolades. The event unfolded in a grand ballroom filled with crystal chandeliers and the hum of powerful investors. Eva wore a tailored midnight blue gown, the color of ambition and resilience. Ethan, dashing in a custom tuxedo, worked the room like a seasoned politician. Cameras flashed as he posed with investors, his arm occasionally brushing Vanessa's in a gesture too casual to be innocent. Throughout the evening, Eva played her part, offering poised smiles and polished small talk. But each glance between Ethan and Vanessa cut like a blade. Their laughter carried a private intimacy, a language of glances and half-smiles that excluded her completely. When the speeches began, Ethan took the stage to thunderous applause. He thanked the team, the investors, and finally the remarkable people who continue to believe in our vision. Eva's name never crossed his lips. Standing at the edge of the stage lights, Eva felt the weight of a truth she could no longer deny. The man she had built an empire with was already rewriting their history, casting her as a footnote in a story she had helped to author. And though the crowd cheered his every word, a quiet resolve began to harden within her, a promise to herself that she would not be erased. The night of the gala lingered in Eva's memory like a bitter aftertaste. Long after the last champagne flute was cleared and the music faded into silence, she lay awake in the penthouse bedroom, staring at the ceiling while the city glittered far below. Ethan had returned well past midnight, carrying the scent of cologne and victory. He had slipped into bed without a word, his breathing deep and even within minutes. Beside him, Eva felt wide awake and weightless, as if the foundation of her life had tilted imperceptibly while the rest of the world applauded. Morning brought no reprieve. Ethan left early for a strategic breakfast, his voice brisk and impersonal as he adjusted his cufflinks. Eva watched him from the doorway, remembering the days when a single smile from him could steady her heart. Now his presence carried the polished distance of a man who had mastered the art of appearances. When the elevator doors closed behind him, the apartment seemed to exhale, leaving only the faint echo of a marriage that was no longer a partnership. Work became her refuge once again. Eva buried herself in numbers, refining algorithms, and preparing investor briefs with the meticulous precision of someone determined to hold on to the reality beneath the illusions. Yet even in the office, the walls seemed to close in. Ethan's schedule grew more erratic, his meetings increasingly confidential. Vanessa Holt's influence was everywhere, her branding proposals slid into board packets without Eva's review, her marketing strategies implemented before Eva could raise a question. Employees who had once turned instinctively to Eva for guidance now looked first to Vanessa, gauging which way the wind was blowing. One afternoon, as Eva crossed the glass lobby of their headquarters, she overheard two junior analysts whispering near the reception desk. They fell silent when they saw her, their eyes wide with the guilt of children caught in a lie. The brief fragments she caught, Vanessa's name, Ethan's laughter, a hotel downtown, were enough to sharpen her suspicions into something more painful than doubt. But Eva kept walking, her face a mask of calm, her mind cataloging each clue like evidence in a trial that had yet to begin. That evening, she opened the secure digital folders she had maintained since the company's earliest days. Patent registrations, founding agreements, intellectual property rights, each document bore her name alongside Ethan's, proof that Crawford Innovations had been built on shared vision and sacrifice. Years earlier, during those frantic nights in their cramped apartment, she had insisted on careful filings and precise legal language. Ethan had teased her for her caution then, calling it unnecessary. Now those papers felt like a lifeline, the quiet foundation of a future she might need to reclaim. Weeks passed in a haze of polished betrayals. Ethan grew bolder in his absences, sometimes disappearing for entire weekends under the pretense of investor retreats. Vanessa's presence became almost ceremonial. She accompanied Ethan to industry summits, posed beside him in press photos, and delivered presentations that hinted at strategies Eva had not approved. The board praised their dynamic synergy, a phrase that made Eva's stomach tighten. When she confronted Ethan privately, asking why decisions were being made without her, he dismissed her concerns with a practiced warmth that felt colder than anger. "You're overthinking this, Eva. We're just moving fast. It's business." But Eva had spent years studying the language of ambition. She recognized the evasions, the half-truths wrapped in charm. And beneath the sting of betrayal, another emotion began to take root, a quiet, calculated resolve. She would not beg for attention or cling to a man who had already turned away. She would watch, learn, and prepare. The empire they had built together was still half hers, and the power she had seeded in contracts and patents remained a weapon hidden in plain sight. The tipping point came on a gray Tuesday morning when Ava arrived at the office to find a sealed envelope waiting on her desk. Inside was a formal notice of an emergency board meeting, scheduled for the following week. The agenda was vague, citing structural adjustments and leadership considerations. Her name appeared nowhere in the preparatory documents. The omission was deliberate, a silent declaration of war. That night, Ava stood at the wide windows of the penthouse, the city spread beneath her like a sea of restless lights. She thought of the girl she had been when she first met Ethan, the dreamer with damp hair and a portfolio of sketches, believing that love and ambition could coexist without cost. She thought of the sacrifices she had made, the heirloom bracelet sold to fund their first prototype, the countless nights of exhaustion, the faith she had placed in a partnership that now existed only in press releases. She allowed herself a single tear, not for Ethan but for the years she could never reclaim. Then she wiped it away and turned back to her desk. The documents she had gathered, patents, contracts, intellectual property agreements, lay in a neat stack, silent witnesses to the truth. They were more than evidence, they were leverage. Ava began drafting quiet emails to trusted allies, arranging discreet meetings with legal advisors who owed her favors from the early days of Crawford Innovations. Outside, the city pulsed with the restless energy of those who believed success was permanent. Inside, Ava began to plot the unmaking of the empire she had helped create. She no longer sought to salvage a marriage that had already been rewritten without her consent. What she wanted now was clarity, power, and the freedom to decide her own ending. The woman who once believed love could weather ambition had been replaced by someone sharper, someone who understood that the foundation of every empire is not trust, but control. And while Ethan basked in the applause of investors and the adoration of his mistress, Ava prepared for the quiet storm that would one day leave him standing alone. The first cracks in Crawford Innovations' glittering facade appeared quietly, like hairline fractures in glass, almost imperceptible until the weight of the structure shifted. Ava noticed them first in the way Ethan began to speak at meetings, not to collaborate, but to perform. His voice, once animated with shared excitement, now carried a smooth cadence meant to impress, punctuated with the occasional wink at Vanessa or a pointed glance to the board. She watched, increasingly aware, as the room's attention followed his every word. Vanessa Holt was no longer just an assistant or consultant. She had become the shadow Ethan seemed unwilling to notice himself walking behind. She laughed at his jokes before he delivered the punchline, anticipated his moves during negotiations, and subtly inserted her own ideas as though they had been his from the start. The board received her with polite smiles, never questioning her authority. Ava, though present, began to feel the invisible walls closing in, the slow suffocation of influence being stripped away. Late nights in the office, once their domain for creation and strategy, had transformed into battlefields of silent tension. Ava found herself working at desks far removed from Ethan's office, separated by glass partitions that seemed more symbolic than functional. She noticed him leaning slightly closer to Vanessa during discussions, sharing quick nods and smirks that excluded her entirely. It was in these moments that Ava realized the problem was no longer purely professional. Ethan's heart, like his attention, had shifted. The first overt sign of betrayal came in the form of a press release. Crawford Innovations was launching a new software suite, one that Ava had spent months perfecting, but her contribution was listed only in passing, almost parenthetically. Ethan had taken the lead in every mention, positioning himself as the sole architect of innovation. Vanessa's name appeared prominently, credited with strategic branding, as though the technical foundation she and Ava had built was secondary to her marketing polish. Ava read the release in stunned silence, her hands gripping the edges of the tablet as the quiet anger began to rise. It was not just professional erasure, it was personal. Ethan had rewritten the narrative of their life together in real time, publicly presenting himself as the genius behind a shared dream while reducing her decades of labor to a footnote. Ava's pulse quickened, but instead of confronting him immediately, she retreated into observation. She began keeping detailed notes of interactions, emails, and board approvals, every sign of Vanessa's growing influence and Ethan's willingness to bend to it. The young analyst in her who had once celebrated collaboration now became a quiet strategist, cataloging evidence for a day that had not yet arrived. As the weeks passed, the company continued to expand, and Ethan's detachment deepened. He stayed late at strategy dinners that conveniently excluded Ava. His phone calls grew longer, often ending with soft chuckles that made her blood run cold. Vanessa accompanied him to client meetings with a familiarity that Ava had once assumed was reserved for spouses or partners. The room seemed to shrink around her, the cityscape outside glowing as though mocking her diminishing presence. Ava found solace in the one arena where she still held uncontested power, the company's intellectual property. Every patent, every algorithm, every foundational contract remained under her name as co-creator. She quietly reviewed legal documents, ensuring that every clause preserved her leverage. She had spent years anticipating the fragility of trust, and now that foresight became her armor. For every boardroom slight, every public omission, she countered with preparation, fortifying a hidden power that Ethan could not yet detect. The personal toll was undeniable. Nights alone in the penthouse became exercises in endurance. Ava's friends noticed her distracted demeanor at gatherings, the tight line of her mouth when Ethan's name surfaced. She forced herself through social obligations, attending gala events and investor dinners as a smiling phantom, her presence functional rather than celebratory. She moved through the world carrying both grief and determination, understanding that the more Ethan ignored her, the more the storm she quietly nurtured gained momentum. Her resilience, however, was accompanied by isolation. The staff, sensing the subtle shift in leadership, began gravitating toward Ethan and Vanessa. Decisions she had once made unilaterally were now discussed in advance with the two of them, reducing her input to advisory comments. Ava observed each exchange carefully, noting how Vanessa's influence subtly altered choices and how Ethan's judgment, once collaborative, now tilted toward protecting appearances rather than substance. The first real test came when an investor requested a confidential audit of Crawford Innovations' core software. Ethan assumed Ava would be too busy to oversee it, delegating the task to Vanessa under the guise of efficiency. Ava, however, had anticipated the possibility. She quietly instructed her trusted legal counsel to ensure the audit complied with her rights, maintaining oversight without alerting Ethan. Watching the audit unfold, she realized how far the gulf had widened, not just in affection, but in authority. Vanessa and Ethan were constructing a narrative of control while Ava prepared to assert the truth on her own terms. It was during one of these long, quiet nights in the office that Ava made her decision. She would not confront Ethan impulsively, nor would she attempt to salvage the illusion of their partnership. The empire they had built together, while thriving in public, was beginning to crumble from internal fractures. She understood now that her love and labor were being weaponized against her, and the only way to reclaim both her dignity and power was to act strategically. Ava spent hours reviewing contracts and patent filings, highlighting clauses that would ensure her ability to intervene if the company's leadership began to act against her interests. She began discreetly reaching out to loyal former employees and advisors, people who had been with her since the earliest days of Crawford Innovations. She explained her plan without revealing specifics, gauging loyalty and commitment. Every interaction strengthened her network, every signature, and promised a silent foundation for the battle she now knew was inevitable. By the time she left the office that night, Ava's resolve was ironclad. The city lights shimmered below her, indifferent witnesses to her quiet metamorphosis. Ethan and Vanessa might have thought they controlled the narrative, but Ava now understood the rules of power in ways they had never anticipated. She had survived erasure, betrayal, and the subtle manipulation of ambition. Now she was preparing not merely to survive, but to reclaim everything that was rightfully hers. The following weeks at Crawford Innovations were a delicate dance of appearances and hidden intentions. Ava moved through the office with a careful grace, smiling politely at colleagues, answering questions with measured calm, while all the while watching Ethan and Vanessa like a strategist observing opposing generals. Every interaction was catalogued in her mind, the inflection of Ethan's voice, the subtle nods he exchanged with Vanessa, the way the board leaned slightly toward her perceived rival. Vanessa's confidence was growing by the day. She had mastered the art of seeming indispensable without overtly claiming authority. Her suggestions were framed as ideas from Ethan's perspective, but delivered with such precision that the board rarely questioned them. She made herself visible, always present at investor calls and client presentations, subtly framing Eva as competent but secondary. The staff had begun to take cues from Vanessa, following her lead in ways Eva had once commanded effortlessly. Eva, however, refused to panic. She spent nights reviewing emails, contracts, and internal communications, tracing every decision back to its source. She discovered patterns: investor favoritism toward initiatives Vanessa suggested, small but telling deviations in strategy that had bypassed her approval, even minor reallocations of resources that benefited Ethan's public image more than the company's long-term stability. Each discovery fueled her resolve. Every slight was a clue, every omission a potential lever. She also began to quietly prepare a network outside the company walls. Former colleagues, trusted legal advisors, and loyal clients received discreet messages, invitations to discuss partnerships and collaborations without Ethan or Vanessa knowing. Eva understood that the fight would not be won solely within Crawford Innovations. She needed allies who could respond when the time came. By the end of each week, she had mapped a silent army of support, people who respected her vision and were willing to follow her lead when the storm broke. The tension between Eva and Ethan became palpable even in the smallest moments. At board meetings, he would lean slightly toward Vanessa, his hand brushing hers as he presented strategies. His laughter, once reserved for Eva's dry wit, now frequently followed Vanessa's subtle quips. Investors noticed, but only in the flattering way people notice charm. They mistook intimacy for collaboration. Eva noted each moment silently, the betrayal etching itself into her mind not as despair but as a strategic calculation. Her own public presence at the company remained polished but understated. She took the high road in all communications, maintaining professionalism while quietly monitoring every development. She would draft emails to the board that emphasized her oversight of core technologies and patents, always precise and factual, never emotional. She understood the optics: any public display of anger could be weaponized against her, but precise, unwavering professionalism would leave her untouchable. Late one evening, Eva discovered an overlooked memo in the company archives, a preliminary contract clause she had drafted during the earliest days of Crawford Innovations. It granted her unilateral rights to approve any transfer of intellectual property and explicitly limited the CEO's ability to make decisions that could compromise patents. She realized the significance immediately. Ethan and Vanessa could continue to assume control publicly, but legally, Eva still held the ultimate authority. It was a safeguard she had long forgotten in the chaos of early growth, a silent weapon she could now wield with devastating precision. Empowered by this knowledge, Eva's strategy shifted. She began planning Novatech in her mind, sketching outlines for a new company that could rival Crawford Innovations without immediate confrontation. It would require careful timing, discreet recruiting, and absolute secrecy. Every call, every meeting, every negotiation would be measured. She could not afford mistakes, not when the stakes were the empire she had helped build, and not when betrayal had become a constant companion. Ethan, oblivious to the silent preparations, continued his descent into overconfidence. He spent nights at high-profile dinners, hand in hand with Vanessa, presenting a curated image of their alliance. His public persona was impeccable, but it was built on assumptions Eva now understood better than anyone. She had spent years mapping every aspect of the company, every key relationship, and every legal safeguard. The very tools Ethan believed were his alone were in fact hers, waiting for the right moment to assert control. Even as Eva planned, she remained vigilant emotionally. She avoided direct confrontation with Ethan, knowing that a misstep could alert him to her growing independence. At home, she maintained the facade of marital normalcy, attending events with a poised smile while observing the quiet patterns of his interactions with Vanessa. She memorized his habits, his preferences, his blind spots, cataloging them in preparation for the day when subtle leverage would become decisive action. Her transformation was complete in silence. Where once Ava's love for Ethan had defined her, it now became a quiet engine for strategy. Betrayal and ambition had sharpened her instincts rather than dulling them. She understood that Crawford Innovations, while thriving publicly, was vulnerable beneath the surface. And she, who had helped build it from nothing, was uniquely positioned to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Weeks passed, each one tightening the invisible web Eva spun. She reached out to early employees under the guise of informal updates, ensuring loyalty and preparing contingency plans. Every meeting with legal counsel was treated as a strategic exercise, refining her understanding of the company's vulnerabilities and her own powers of intervention. Eva understood that patience was essential. A premature strike could fracture her position rather than secure it. The cracks were no longer subtle, they were now fractures running through the foundation. Ethan's arrogance blinded him to the slow, steady preparation occurring beneath his feet. Vanessa's influence, though potent, was not yet absolute. Eva had everything she needed to reclaim both her authority and her dignity. And as she stood by the office window late at night, watching the city shimmer below, she realized that the next phase of the struggle would determine not just the future of the company, but the trajectory of her own life. It was during one of the longest stretches of consecutive workdays that Eva noticed the unmistakable shift in Ethan's behavior, one that could no longer be excused as overwork or ambition. Vanessa had become not just a colleague, but a confidant in decisions Eva had once controlled. Ethan sought her opinion before his own wife's, valued her suggestions over Ava's, and even laughed at private jokes that Eva had no part in. The subtle usurpation had become blatant, and yet Ethan did not seem to realize the consequences of his arrogance. Eva spent nights observing their interactions through emails, calendar invites, and the occasional lingering glance she could intercept. Every message between Ethan and Vanessa, every offhand comment, became a piece of the mosaic she was quietly constructing. Where once she had invested every ounce of trust and love in their marriage and business, she now invested her intelligence, her patience, and her foresight. She cataloged their strategies, their weaknesses, and their blind spots, preparing for a confrontation that would not come immediately but would be decisive when it did. One afternoon, a particularly jarring moment occurred during a private investor meeting. Ethan presented a new expansion plan without her knowledge. Eva, seated at the side of the boardroom, listened as investors praised him for his innovative foresight. Vanessa leaned in slightly, nodding approvingly, reinforcing Ethan's points with subtle affirmations. Every word, every smile, every gesture was designed to marginalize Eva without causing overt conflict. The precision of it left Eva momentarily breathless, but also sparked a surge of resolve. She realized that the empire she had helped build was being rewritten, chapter by chapter, with her role erased. Returning to her office, Eva closed the door behind her and allowed herself a single moment of reflection. She had spent years sacrificing sleep, relationships, and personal comfort to build this company. Her efforts had turned small contracts into multi-million-dollar deals. Yet here she was, treated as an invisible presence, her contributions reduced to footnotes in a narrative she had authored. The sting of betrayal settled in her chest, but it did not break her. Instead, it crystallized into a cold, deliberate determination. Her first step was legal reinforcement. Eva combed through every contract, patent, and agreement related to the company's intellectual property. Her meticulous record-keeping revealed several clauses she had drafted in the earliest days of Crawford Innovations, clauses that granted her explicit rights to approve major decisions, protect proprietary technology, and maintain oversight of software transfers. She realized that while Ethan and Vanessa believed they were consolidating control, the true authority remained quietly in her hands. Emboldened, Eva began to test the limits of her leverage subtly. She raised minor objections in meetings, citing clauses she had anticipated might become critical. Each time Ethan attempted to override her, she referenced the legal documentation calmly, never with anger, always with precision. The board began to notice the invisible force she wielded. While Ethan's charm could influence perception, Ava's facts and rights remained unassailable. It was a quiet power, unseen by most, but it shifted the balance subtly in her favor. Meanwhile, Vanessa's presence became more complex. Eva observed that her rival's influence was not solely a product of her own ambition. Vanessa relied on Ethan's blind loyalty to her charm and flattery. She seemed confident, but in private, she depended entirely on Ethan to maintain her position. Eva took note of this dependency, understanding that Vanessa's strength was conditional, a weakness Eva could exploit when the timing was right. Emotionally, Eva had to compartmentalize. She could no longer afford the vulnerability that had once defined her relationship with Ethan. Each pang of hurt, each flicker of betrayal, was stored away and converted into strategic thought. Her love had transformed into calculation, her grief became preparation. In this new reality, every interaction, every meeting, every casual gesture was analyzed for information and leverage. Outside the office, Eva quietly began reaching out to trusted former employees, old collaborators, and discreet legal advisors. She positioned herself as an invisible architect, reinforcing her network without revealing her plans. She spoke in neutral tones, offering guidance and insight under the guise of mentorship, all while quietly identifying allies who could respond when the moment arrived. By the time the board began to formally recognize Vanessa's influence, Eva had already secured a network of loyalty and strategic advantage that neither Ethan nor Vanessa could detect. Despite the growing tension, the company thrived publicly. Investors were delighted with new software iterations and marketing campaigns, all of which bore Eva's fingerprints in subtle but crucial ways. She remained the quiet engine driving the business, even as her public profile diminished. The irony was not lost on her. The very company that Ethan paraded as his achievement was sustained by the work of the woman he was systematically sidelining. One evening, Eva stood at her office window, overlooking the city skyline, and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a cafe meeting in the rain to sleepless nights in a tiny apartment, she had poured every ounce of creativity, discipline, and sacrifice into building an empire. Now, as she watched Ethan and Vanessa maneuver for public and private control, she felt a cold exhilaration. The groundwork had been laid, the instruments of power were in her hands. She had been sidelined, underestimated, and betrayed, but she was not powerless. The cracks in the empire were becoming fissures, and Eva understood that with patience, precision, and discretion, those fissures could become the very means by which she reclaimed authority. Ethan and Vanessa were blinded by arrogance, their confidence in each other's loyalty creating gaps in their armor. Eva had spent years observing, recording, and planning, and now the stage was set for the first moves in a game that only she fully understood. As the office emptied late that night, Eva remained behind, reviewing documents and tracing lines of authority, her mind alive with possibilities. Each patent, each contract, each carefully preserved clause was a weapon. Each loyal former employee, each silent ally, was a piece of the network she could call upon. She had transformed betrayal into strategy, erasure into opportunity. And as the city lights shimmered below, Eva made a silent vow: she would not only survive this betrayal, she would rise stronger than the empire that had sought to forget her. By the time the next board meeting arrived, Eva had already positioned herself to observe every move Ethan and Vanessa made. She arrived early, reviewing the agenda while sipping her coffee, noting each item that had been slipped into the meeting without her input. Her meticulous attention to detail had revealed patterns, decisions made hastily, approvals bypassed, and subtle shifts in authority designed to marginalize her. Each observation was logged mentally, creating a precise map of vulnerability she could exploit when the time was right. Ethan entered with his usual confidence, the charisma that had once drawn investors like moths to a flame fully on display. Vanessa followed closely, her heels clicking in rhythm with his steps as if the office floor itself recognized her place beside him. The boardroom greeted them warmly, and as the meeting commenced, Eva watched the interactions unfold with calculated patience. She noticed the nods, the micro-gestures, the way the board deferred to Vanessa's suggestions as if they were Ethan's ideas rephrased. It was subtle, but Eva understood the mechanics of influence. She observed how Vanessa's smile softened objections, how her well-timed affirmations steered discussions without ever seeming domineering. Ethan, for his part, had become complicit in this performance, leaning into the dynamics as though it were natural for his wife's contributions to be sidelined. Eva clenched her jaw, a cold fire lighting her mind. The empire she had helped build was being rewritten in real time, but the author remained within her grasp. As discussions turned to the company's latest contracts, Eva noted discrepancies between the documents and the representations Ethan had made. Minor details, profit-sharing percentages, intellectual property clauses, licensing agreements, had been altered subtly in favor of external consultants and investors. Each deviation was a violation of the agreements she had meticulously drafted and safeguarded. Where most would see mistakes, Eva recognized strategy and arrogance. Ethan and Vanessa were confident that she would not notice, and they were right in one sense, wrong in another. After the meeting, Eva retreated to her office, closing the door to gather her thoughts. She reviewed every contract, every memo, every email chain, and identified the vulnerabilities Ethan and Vanessa had exposed themselves to through overconfidence. Their reliance on appearances rather than substance left gaps in authority, oversight, and legal compliance. Eva realized that the very tools Ethan had used to marginalize her were now avenues for reclaiming control. Her next step was subtle reinforcement of loyalty among the staff. She scheduled one-on-one meetings under the pretext of mentorship, offering guidance and insight while discreetly gauging commitment. She encouraged questions, listened to concerns, and quietly reminded employees of her central role in the company's foundation. Slowly, she rebuilt trust and alignment with those who had once followed her without hesitation. By the end of the week, she had restored a network of influence that balanced, if not exceeded, Vanessa's reach. Meanwhile, Ethan and Vanessa remained oblivious to the depth of Eva's preparations. They continued their public displays, smiling for photographs, exchanging whispered jokes, presenting a united front for the board and investors. Their confidence was absolute, bordering on arrogance, and Eva knew it would be their undoing. People who assume infallibility often fail to anticipate the patience and strategy of those they underestimate, and Eva had spent years observing, recording, and planning. Late that evening, alone in her office, Eva allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The betrayal she had endured was no longer simply a personal affront, it was a catalyst for transformation. She understood now that Crawford Innovations, though thriving publicly, was vulnerable beneath the surface. Every misstep by Ethan or Vanessa, every assumption of control, became an opportunity to assert her rights, influence decisions, and reclaim authority. Her thoughts turned to the next phase of action. Public confrontation was unnecessary and premature. What was required was timing, precision, and the deployment of the legal and strategic tools she had long safeguarded. Eva knew that by leveraging patents, contracts, and the loyalty of key personnel, she could undermine Ethan's assumptions and shift control without exposing herself to risk. She drafted contingency plans, listing each possible scenario and a corresponding response. What if Ethan attempted to transfer intellectual property without her consent? What if he publicly downplayed her role in a major announcement? What if Vanessa sought to solidify her position further? Each contingency had a response, measured and deliberate, designed to protect Eva's interests while preserving the element of surprise. By the time the city lights outside the office shimmered through the glass walls, Eva felt a quiet satisfaction. She had transformed betrayal into strategy, marginalization into preparation. Ethan and Vanessa, confident in their assumed dominance, were unaware that the foundations of their apparent power rested on permissions she alone controlled. Every contract they overlooked, every procedural shortcut they took, became a weapon in her hands. That night, as she walked home through the streets she had once traversed hand in hand with Ethan, Eva understood that the cracks she had observed for months were no longer minor fractures. They were fissures capable of collapse, and she held the tools to determine when and how that collapse would occur. The empire had been shaken, but not destroyed. And she, who had been sidelined, underestimated, and betrayed, was poised to rise stronger, wiser, and more resolute than ever before. The second act of her journey, of observation, awareness, and preparation, was complete. The cracks in the empire were now visible to all who looked closely, but only Eva truly understood their depth and the power they represented. Ethan and Vanessa were dancing on fragile ground, and she, patient and strategic, held the map of every weakness, every leverage point, every path to reclaiming what was rightfully hers. The morning Ethan fired Ava arrived with an unsettling quiet. The city outside shimmered with early sunlight, unaware of the storm that would erupt inside Crawford Innovations. Ava, as always, arrived early at the office, her mind methodical and alert, reviewing contracts and plans. She carried no suspicion that today, the very man she had loved and built an empire with would move to sever the foundation of their partnership entirely. The board meeting was called hastily. Ava noticed the tension immediately. Ethan's casual confidence felt rehearsed, his usual charm edged with calculation. Vanessa trailed slightly behind him, a poised figure who now seemed inseparable from every strategic move he made. The board members were polite but nervous, as though sensing that a confrontation would unfold, yet unsure on whose side to stand. Ethan began the meeting with a rehearsed speech about strategic restructuring and streamlining leadership for efficiency. Ava's instincts prickled. The words were carefully chosen, a veneer of corporate prudence designed to mask personal motives. Every syllable was a trap she could see forming, yet she remained composed, her calm a shield against the growing tension. Then it happened. Ethan, looking her squarely in the eyes, spoke the words she had long feared but never expected. Ava, your services are no longer required at Crawford Innovations. The board and I have decided to terminate your position, effective immediately. The room seemed to freeze. Ava felt the weight of years of dedication and sacrifice pressing down, yet her expression remained neutral. There was no outburst, no trembling hand. Instead, a precise calm took hold, the kind of control she had cultivated during months of preparation. She had anticipated this moment in countless scenarios, and while the betrayal was personal, it did not catch her unprepared. Vanessa smiled ever so slightly, the subtle triumph barely perceptible, but it fueled the undeniable truth. Ethan's decision was not driven by business but by the influence of the woman he had allowed to replace his wife's authority. Every careful move she had observed over the past months, the dinners, late-night meetings, whispered assurances, culminated in this act of personal and professional erasure. Ava stood, closing her laptop with deliberate calm. Her mind catalogued the situation with the precision of a strategist. The board's approval did not nullify her rights, contracts and intellectual property agreements still bore her authority. The patents she had filed in the company's earliest days, the clauses she had meticulously safeguarded, remained untouched. Ethan had assumed that firing her would strip her of power, but he had overlooked the foundation she had quietly built, the leverage she had quietly preserved. I understand, Ava said, her voice steady, resonant with authority despite the blow. I will coordinate the transition of my responsibilities in accordance with our agreements. No one questioned the composure. Her words, though simple, carried the unspoken weight of knowledge. She left the room with quiet dignity, each step deliberate, the eyes of the board and Vanessa following her like ripples in water. Outside the office, Ava paused briefly, inhaling the cool morning air. The betrayal stung, yes, but beneath the shock was the steady, growing power of preparation. Back in her office, she began discreetly gathering what she needed. Every file, every copy of the patents, every legal document that could assert her continued authority over Crawford Innovations was catalogued. Ava's plan, crafted over months of observation and meticulous documentation, was now ready to be executed. She was no longer a passive participant in the narrative Ethan had rewritten. She was about to reclaim control, not with anger, but with precision. The staff, loyal and private but constrained by fear and uncertainty, began to murmur quietly. Ava reached out to them subtly, not to incite rebellion, but to reassure allies that her exit was strategic, temporary, and calculated. She reminded key personnel of agreements and oversight measures, hinting at the authority she still legally retained. Slowly, a network of loyalty and compliance began to form around her, unseen by Ethan and Vanessa, yet capable of decisive action when needed. Ethan, unaware of the depth of her preparations, celebrated the apparent victory. He moved through the office with Vanessa at his side, basking in the perception of unchallenged dominance. Yet each step they took, each confident gesture, played into the very strategy Ava had designed. Their arrogance had blinded them to the quiet power she had preserved.
That night, Ava returned home briefly, the penthouse now a hollow reminder of what had been lost. She stood by the window, looking at the city that had once seemed full of possibility. Now it felt like a chessboard, each light and shadow a piece in a game of strategy and foresight. The betrayal was personal, yes, but it had become the catalyst for transformation. She would not confront Ethan with anger. She would dismantle the illusion he had built, one calculated move at a time.